The wind was a constant, gnawing presence out here on the fringes, a skeletal hand rattling the panes of the small, solitary cabin. Alara lived by its rhythm, a desolate waltz she danced alone. Dust coated everything, the rough-hewn table, the empty shelves, the photograph face down in the corner. Her own face, when she caught sight of it in the tarnished mirror, was a study in depletion. Eyes holding the flat, vacant stare of someone who had watched everything wither and blow away. Loss had stripped her clean, leaving only the raw, exposed bone of existence. Each day was a slow, silent battle against the creeping paralysis of despair. Food was scarce, fuel scarcer, and human contact a faded memory she no longer trusted herself to recall. The nearest town was a day's ride, a place she had fled, not just because of the whispers and the turned backs, but because the sheer weight of others' presence felt like suffocation. Here, the silence was a balm, albeit a cold one. It mirrored the emptiness inside her, a vast, echoing chasm where a vibrant life used to be. She spent her days in motion, chopping the scant with the land offered, mending fences that held nothing in, foraging for roots and berries that barely sustained her. It was a ritual of survival, devoid of hope, performed out of instinct more than will. One bruised twilight, as the sky bled purple and gray, a shadow detached itself from the horizon. A man, a stranger, leading a limping, mud-caked dog. He approached the cabin slowly, deliberately. Alara watched from the window, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. Strangers out here meant trouble. Always. She reached for the only defense she possessed, a heavy iron poker by the hearth, its weight familiar in her trembling hand. The man stopped a dozen yards from the cabin, his form silhouetted against the dying light. He did not call out. He simply stood there, a silent, imposing figure. The dog whined softly, nudging his leg. Then, he did something that made Alara lower the poker, her hand falling uselessly to her side. He shifted his weight, and in his arms, bundled against his chest, was something small. Something impossibly small and utterly out of place in this stark, unforgiving landscape. He took a few more steps, reaching the cabin door. He raised a hand, not to knock, but to shield his eyes against the last glare. Alara stood frozen, the cold seeping into her bones, not just from the wind, but from the sheer, unfathomable nature of this arrival. He waited, the silence stretched, taut and fragile. Finally, she moved, a puppet on strings pulled by a force she did not understand. She unbolted the door. The man stepped into the meager light, the dog following hesitantly. He was weathered, lean, his face a roadmap of hard living, eyes deep-set and assessing, and the bundle in his arms stirred, emitting a tiny, fragile cry that pierced the desolate silence of the cabin and Alara's own carefully constructed shell of indifference. It was a baby. He didn't introduce himself, nor did he offer explanations. He simply held the bundle towards her, his gaze steady, weary. "Found it," was all he said, his voice low and rough like stones grinding. "By the creek bed." With the dog, Alara stared at the baby, swaddled in a worn blanket, a tiny face puckered in sleep, impossibly vulnerable. The scent of it, faint and sweet beneath the dust and the harsh air, was a shock to her system, stirring a deep, buried memory she had tried for so long to extinguish. She didn't reach for it. She couldn't. Her hands felt clumsy, unworthy. The man didn't press. He stepped further inside, his presence filling the small space, displacing the familiar emptiness. The dog, a scruffy, loyal mutt, curled up near the door, watching them with intelligent eyes. "Needs warmth," the man added, glancing at the dying embers in the hearth. He didn't ask if he could stay. He simply acted, moving to the hearth, kneeling, coaxing the fire back to life with practiced ease. Alara watched him, mesmerized. His movements were efficient, silent. He was an intrusion, a disruption, yet his presence wasn't hostile. It was simply there. The baby fussed, a tiny whimper. The man looked at it, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face, then back at the fire. Alara finally moved, reaching for a kettle, filling it with the last of her water. The automatic motions of hospitality felt alien after so long. She needed answers, but his silence was a wall she couldn't breach with questions she couldn't articulate. Who was he? Where had he come from? And this baby? How could it be found out here, alone, with only a dog for company? The harshness of the land offered no comfort, only the constant threat of exposure, starvation, oblivion. For a baby to survive even a short time was a miracle, or perhaps a terrible oversight by death. The man added more wood to the fire. Flames licked at the dry timber, casting dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the dust motes swirling in the air. The baby's cry grew louder, a hungry sound. Alara's gaze was drawn back to the small face, so utterly dependent, so fragile. It was a mirror held up to her own vulnerability, a stark reflection of the helplessness she felt in the face of her own life. Yet, something else stirred within her, a faint, unfamiliar current beneath the surface of her despair. It was the pull of responsibility, unbidden, unwelcome, but undeniably present. The man looked up, meeting her eyes across the growing warmth of the fire. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet waiting. The baby cried again. The baby's hunger became the immediate, undeniable reality that forced Alara into action. It superseded the questions, the fear, the inertia of her grief. She had no milk, nothing remotely suitable. Her pantry held only dried beans, salt pork, and flour. She looked at the man, her expression pleading without words. He understood. "I have a tin," he said, reaching into his coat. He produced a small, battered container, the label faded. Powdered milk, and a single, clean rag. He looked at her, a silent question. Could she? She hesitated for only a moment. The baby's cries were relentless now, small fists batting the air. This tiny life demanding absolute. It was a stark contrast to the silence that had been her companion. Alara took the tin and the rag. Her hands, though rough and calloused, moved with a forgotten tenderness as she mixed a small amount of the powder with water from the kettle he had heated. Testing the temperature on her wrist, a memory surfaced, faint, painful, quickly buried. She dipped a corner of the rag into the mixture and brought it to the baby's lips. The infant latched on instantly, sucking with surprising strength. A quiet settled over the cabin, broken only by the soft lapping sound and the crackle of the fire. The man watched, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer help, didn't interfere. He allowed her this task, this first step. As the baby fed, its cries subsided, replaced by soft sighs of contentment. Alara felt a strange sensation bloom in her chest, unfamiliar and unsettling. It was a flicker of warmth in the vast coldness. When the baby finished, she held it for a moment longer, the small weight in her arms a revelation. Felt right in a way nothing had felt in years. The man cleared his throat. "You can't keep it," he stated, not unkindly, just stating a fact of their desolate existence. Alara stiffened, her brief moment of connection shattering. He was right, of course. They were barely surviving themselves. Taking on a child out here was madness, a death sentence for them all. Yet, the thought of the baby being taken away, back into the harsh unknown or into the cold, judging world of the town, sent a jolt of protest through her. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice raspy. He shrugged, a weary gesture. "Nearest town is a day. Don't know what they'll do with it there. Orphanage, maybe. Or worse," he didn't elaborate. But she knew what worse could mean in places that had little patience or charity for the unwanted. The baby stirred, opening its eyes. They were a startling blue, clear and innocent. They looked up at her, trusting. Alara felt something clench deep inside her. She couldn't send it away. Not now. Not after holding it. "It needs care," she said, her voice stronger this time. "Real care," the man nodded slowly. "That's why I brought it here," he paused. "You're the only one for miles," and then, quietly, "and the dog. It led me this way." Like it knew, he glanced at the mutt sleeping by the door, a silent, shaggy guardian. It seemed absurd, A dog leading a man to a baby, and to her cabin of all places. Yet, looking at the man's earnest, tired face, and then at the peaceful baby in her arms, Alara found she couldn't dismiss it. It felt like fate, a cruel, demanding twist in the desolate path she walked. She looked at the baby again, then at the man. "We can't stay here," she said, the "we" slipping out before she could stop it. It encompassed her, the baby, and astonishingly, him. It was a declaration, a tentative step towards acknowledging a shared burden. He met her gaze, a flicker of understanding passing between them. The vast, empty space of her cabin suddenly felt less lonely, but infinitely more precarious. The silence was still there, but it was different now, filled with the soft breathing of the child and the quiet presence of the stranger and his dog. The raw vulnerability of the baby had cracked through her own hardened shell, demanding not just survival, but protection. They settled into a fragile rhythm dictated by the baby's needs. The man, who introduced himself only as Elias, was a man of few words, but his actions were steady and capable. He repaired a leak in the roof, reinforced the shutters against the relentless wind, and worked tirelessly to gather more wood, his movements economical and strong. Alara found herself watching him, observing the quiet competence with which he navigated the harsh environment. He expected nothing, asked for nothing, simply shared the meager resources she had and added his own skill and effort. The dog, a watchful presence named simply Dog by Elias, seemed to understand its role, often lying near the baby's makeshift crib, a padded drawer pulled from an old dresser, its presence a silent comfort. Alara cared for the baby, her initial awkwardness replaced by a natural instinct she hadn't known she possessed. Feeding, changing, rocking, these simple acts became the anchors of her day, pulling her back from the edge of the abyss. The baby's smiles, when they came, were like sunbursts in the perpetual gray of her emotional landscape. She learned to read its cues, its tiny language of needs. Elias never commented on her transformation, but his eyes, whenever he looked at her or the baby, held a quiet respect that was more potent than any praise. They talked little, their communication a shared glance, a gesture, a mutual understanding born of shared purpose. The harsh environment remained a constant threat. Early snow dusted the ground. The wind howled with increased ferocity. Supplies were dwindling. They couldn't stay isolated forever. The world outside, the world she had fled, would eventually intrude. And there was the baby. A baby needed more than shelter and powdered milk eventually. It needed a place, a name, a history. It was a beacon that would draw attention, wanted or unwanted. Alara knew they faced a choice. Disappear further into the wilderness, a near impossible feat with an infant as winter closed in, or confront the world they both seemed to be hiding from. The tension in the cabin, though unspoken, was palpable. One evening, as the storm raged outside, shaking the very foundations of the cabin, Elias spoke, his voice barely audible above the wind. "We can't keep hiding," he said, stating the truth that lay between them. Alara held the sleeping baby close. She felt a fierce protectiveness rise up, a strength she hadn't felt in years. The despair was still there, a shadow in the corners of her mind, but it no longer consumed her. The baby, and Elias's quiet presence, had given her something to fight for. "They'll ask questions," she replied, thinking of the town, the people who had judged her. "About the baby. About you." He was an unknown, a man who had appeared out of nowhere with a foundling. Suspicion would fall easily. "Let them," Elias said, his jaw set. "We did what was right." It was a simple statement, but the conviction in his voice resonated with her. It was the first time in a long time someone had spoken of right in a way that felt true, uncomplicated by the ugliness of human judgment. The storm outside intensified, a furious, battering force. A sudden, violent gust tore a shutter loose, sending splintered wood and cold air blasting into the cabin. The baby cried out, startled awake. Cold air clawed into the cabin through the broken window. The baby's cries were sharp, panicked. Elias was instantly on his feet, moving with a speed that belied his earlier weariness. "Board it up," he shouted. The first time Alara had heard his voice raised. Alara, clutching the infant, scrambled away from the blast of wind and snow. Elias grabbed blankets, stuffing them into the jagged opening as a temporary measure, then seized a hammer and pieces of wood he had stacked for repairs. The storm outside was a white fury, the wind a monstrous roar. Working in the biting cold and the swirling snow that invaded their small space, Elias hammered the boards into place. Alara watched, helpless with the baby, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. But it wasn't just fear for herself. It was fear for the child, for this fragile new life that had landed in her desolate world. As Elias worked, his face grim with concentration, Alara felt a surge of something akin to partnership. They were in this together, bound by the storm and the helpless life they sheltered. She wasn't alone facing the wind and the cold and the encroaching darkness, both literal and figurative. When Elias finished, the window was roughly boarded, the cabin plunged into deeper shadow, but the wind was mostly blocked. He turned, his breath misting in the cold air, and met her eyes. The shared ordeal, the mutual effort, however small on her part in that moment, had forged a new link between them. The baby, soothed by being held close to Alara and the returning warmth of the fire, was quieting down. Elias sank back onto the floor near the hearth, his chest heaving. Dog nudged his hand. "That was close," Alara whispered, the words snatched by the lingering drafts. Elias just nodded, staring into the fire. They had faced the storm, the external threat, and survived. But the deeper challenge remained. The storm outside eventually subsided, leaving an unnerving silence and a world transformed by snow. The air was crisp, clean, but the blanket of white emphasized their isolation. The morning light, when it finally broke through the clouds, revealed a landscape of stark beauty, challenging and unforgiving. They couldn't stay, not through the full force of winter with a baby. The unspoken decision solidified between them. They would go to town, together, with the baby. The fear was still there, a tremor beneath Alara's skin, but it was tempered by a newfound resolve. She looked at the baby sleeping peacefully in the drawer crib, then at Elias, who was sharpening his knife by the fire. His stoic profile offered no easy comfort, but his presence itself was a reassurance. He was not a rescuer in the traditional sense, but a fellow survivor, walking alongside her on an unexpected path. The desolation had not lifted entirely, perhaps it never would, but it no longer felt absolute. The small, beating heart of the baby, the quiet strength of the man, the loyal presence of the dog, they had filled the echoing chasm inside her with something tentative yet resilient: life. Alara had come to this place to disappear, to let the world forget her and to forget the world that had hurt her. But life, in its stubborn, unpredictable way, had found her. It had arrived on the wind, led by a dog, in the form of a helpless infant and the silent, capable man who carried it. Her journey from despair to resilience had not been a solitary one. It had been forged in shared hardship, in the quiet understanding that passed between two strangers brought together by chance and necessity. The baby had been the catalyst, a tiny, demanding force of nature that shattered her paralysis. Elias had been the steady presence, offering not platitudes, but action and a quiet strength that allowed her own dormant resilience to surface. The cabin on the edge of the world, a symbol of her retreat, was now a symbol of their beginning, a temporary haven from which they would face the unknown together. The path ahead would be difficult. The town meant scrutiny, questions, the potential for judgment and interference. But looking at the baby, now awake and gurgling softly, reaching tiny hands towards the firelight, Alara felt a fierce certainty. She would protect this child. And in doing so, she would protect the fragile hope that had taken root in the barren landscape of her life. The man, Elias, rose and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered land. Dog rose with him, resting its head against his leg. They were a unit now, an unlikely trio bound by an extraordinary circumstance. Alara wrapped the baby snugly in a blanket. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, She felt ready to face it, not with the vacant stare of depletion, but with the quiet, determined strength of someone who had found something precious in the emptiness, and who knew, with every fiber of her being, that she would fight to keep it. Their lives, once separate streams flowing towards different oceans of solitude, had merged, irrevocably altered by a stray dog and an abandoned baby. The journey had taken an unexpected turn, leading them not deeper into isolation, but towards a fragile, yet resilient, connection in a world that had tried to break them. It was not the life she had planned, or the life she had lost, but it was a life, demanding and real, filled with the quiet promise of morning light after a long, dark storm.